Hi, everybody. May I greet you a good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Biodiversity Finance MOOC team to the fifth webinar. This course is offered by the United Nations Development Program Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or BIOFIN, in partnership with the UNDP Global Program on Nature for Development, the NBSAP Forum, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the OECD. Financial support is provided by the governments of the European Union, Flanders, Norway, Germany, and Switzerland, and the GEF. My name is Abby Trinidad, and I will be your facilitator for today. I am a Senior Technical Advisor for BIOFIN, handling the following countries: the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and Bhutan. And we are very grateful for your participation in this webinar titled Biodiversity Financial Needs Assessment. I will provide a short introduction to this session, to be followed by country experiences from the Philippines and Sri Lanka. Before we proceed, let me present our speakers for this session. From the Philippines is Ms. Annabel Plantilla. She's the Philippines Project Manager for BIOFIN. Ms. Plantilla is a licensed environmental planner with a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of the Philippines and a bachelor's degree in environmental planning from Miriam College. Her professional career spans several government positions, stints with the private sector and academia, and a long affiliation with Haribon Foundation as former Chief Operating Officer. From Sri Lanka is Mr. Ramita Wijatunga. Ramita is the National Project Coordinator for BIOFIN in Sri Lanka. He has been with the UNDP in Sri Lanka since 2007. He was managing several disaster risk management and environment-related projects of UNDP. Before joining UNDP, he has worked for Practical Action as a regional program manager for South Asia region. He holds 2 master's degrees in sociology and business management, and his first basic degree is in agricultural economics. Welcome, Annabel and Ramita, and thank you again for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. And of course, I want to welcome all participants to this webinar. Before we begin, I would like to share with you some rules and dynamics for our webinar session. First, microphones will be muted during the presentation. This will reduce interference and facilitate communication. The session will last for 90 minutes. My introductory presentation will last for about 10 minutes, and this will be followed by 2 presentations from the Philippines and Sri Lanka, lasting for about 15 minutes each. Presentations will be followed by the Q&A at the end. If you think of a question while the presentation is in progress, please share it with us via the chat window on the right hand of your screen. We will read your question during the Q&A session after the presentation. If you want to speak and the connection allows it, we will open your microphones during the Q&A session. To let us know that you'd like to speak, simply raise your hand by clicking the hand button in the lower right corner and selecting Raise Hand. The chat window will remain open throughout the webinar if you'd like to interact with us or other participants in the session. The Click Meeting interface will be, by default, displayed in English, but it is possible to change the entire web page to your preferred language at the top of the screen. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Learning for Nature YouTube channel. All participants will receive an email when the recording is available. The presentation for today's webinar will be available in the course room on Learning for Nature under the Week 5 tab shortly after this session. Let me now proceed with the introduction to the session. Jenna, kindly put up the slides. Thank you very much. During this presentation, I will provide highlights of the BIOFIN Financial Needs Assessment, which I shall alternately refer to throughout this discussion as either the FNA or costing. Details on country approaches will be provided by our speakers from the Philippines and Sri Lanka. How much money do we need to achieve the biodiversity targets? Who needs it most? What activities should be prioritized for funding? What is the money going to be used for? These are very basic questions which are essential as we prepare budgets for government funding, as we process a grant or loan for ODA funding, or even when we request for money from corporations. How much is it do we really need? The proposition sounds very simple, right? But it's not really as simple as that. As we implemented BIOFIN across 30 countries, we realized the process was not that simple for the following reasons. First, the NBSAPs are not readily costable. Some were motherhood documents that did not contain any targets, thus making it difficult to determine what types of investments or recurrent expenses are required. Second, many countries have not used a bottom-up budgeting approach, relying mainly on incremental budgeting processes, which does not allow for a process which determines expenditure needs to match the overall targets. Third, some countries had biodiversity targets enshrined in other policies apart from the NBSAP. So several nuances can be observed as we had implemented the financial needs assessment in the 30 BIOFIN countries. The BIOFIN methodology and the specific workbooks are interrelated and feed into each other, as well as to the Biodiversity Finance Plan. Those of you who have attended the third webinar on the policy and institutional review, and the fourth webinar last week on the biodiversity expenditure review will see a lot of wisdom in going through the whole logical process. The FNA builds on and should be compatible with the national planning and budgeting practices and approaches that have already been identified in the policy and institutional review. The process also relies on analysis of documents, strategies, and priorities assessed in the PIR. This financial needs assessment helps refine and apply the system used for categorizing, attributing, and tagging expenditures in the BER. A sound process for estimating biodiversity finance needs, allowing comparisons of specific finance needs with available financial resources, can guide prioritization, development, and implementation of finance solutions in the BFP. The PIR and BER have identified agencies or stakeholders who are mandated to contribute to the attainment of NBSAP goals. During the FNA process, it is useful to involve all of these agencies. The objectives of the FNA. First is to clarify strategies and actions in national biodiversity plans, such as the NBSAP, to describe costable actions that link to expected biodiversity results in a logical framework that lends itself to prioritization and detailed costing. If possible, the costing process shall necessitate a refinement of NBSAP, and at this point, it would be useful to engage with the experts who contributed to the formulation of the NBSAP. The second objective is to cost actions by defining unit costs and quantities over the target time period. Oftentimes, you do not have to start from scratch. There are cost norms used by planning agencies, or sometimes project or program design reports will also contain information on unit costs. The third objective of the FNA is to use the costing as basis to develop detailed budgets to make a stronger case for biodiversity finance. And we find that constructing detailed budgets consistent in form and content with prevailing government norms are more appreciated and readily useful. Fourth objective, prioritize biodiversity strategies and actions based on specific biodiversity and cost criteria. One thing we learned is that costing the NBSAP helps refine targets by introducing cost effectiveness or cost efficiency parameters. You will see which are the main cost items and the associated actions, and by doing so, you will be able to match whether these are priority actions or not. And of course, the fifth objective is to estimate unmet biodiversity finance needs. I apologize, there's a thunderstorm that's going on, so you might be hearing that in the background. Okay, so the last is to estimate unmet biodiversity finance needs, or what we call as the funding gap. This slide shows various types of costing approaches which are implemented across BIOFIN countries with increasing degree of complexity, increasing use of empirical data, and increasing need for partner engagement as we go from top to bottom. In the incremental budgeting approach, simple percentages are applied on an annual basis. Sometimes this is pegged to inflation or other macroeconomic metrics and does not reflect the actual needs. Many of the countries actually use the incremental budgeting approach. Next is historical projections. This require a long-term time series to smooth out peaks and troughs, and the average is applied to extend the cost requirements. It is also not very accurate and is not reflective of what is really needed. Cost modeling provides a greater level of detail based on project experience, and the costs are extrapolated, but it can be challenged because of some geographic specificities. BIOFIN recommends at least utilizing an activity-based costing as a standard for doing the F&A. In this method, the bottom-up budgeting is applied so the targets are identified and the actions that will contribute to the targets are costed. This will require a lot of pre-work and consultations. The results-based budgeting is the preferred methodology. It is an improvement over the activity-based costing with the use of a log frame to ensure that actions are all contributing to the target. The steps in implementing the F&A. First is the preparation. In the preparation, we establish a team with appropriate skills and capacity to conduct the F&A, invite key stakeholders and define their roles, establish a consultation plan, and begin consultations on the methodology. Step 2 is to scope and clarify the biodiversity targets, results, strategies, and actions. This is where we translate the NBSAP or other national priorities to a logical framework that converts the biodiversity results and indicators into costable actions, and here is where we make an initial prioritization of biodiversity results and strategies. 3, we prepare initial costing tables. Here, we identify unit costs, we research on unit costs for common budget items like salaries, vehicles, human resources, infrastructure, etc. And here, we build our cost tables, and here is where we have a very data-intensive stage. Fourth, we refine the costs with expert inputs and the results of the costing using individual expert consultations. This could be an iterative process until a consensus is reached on an acceptable cost level. Next, we analyze the costing results. We prepare a multi-cost matrix. We can subdivide by strategies, by targets, by sectors, actors, depending on stakeholder needs, and compare costs to biodiversity priorities. We also compare the detailed costing statements with the projected available financing or estimated future expenditures as calculated using the BER. This is where we estimate the unmet financing needs or the financing gap. Finance gap. The BER and the F&A are most often not fully comparable. The BER looks at historical spending, while the F&A is prospective. The BER uses budget data for a minimum of 5 years, while the F&A creates new data. While the BER seeks to capture the status quo, the F&A instead seeks to capture the additional costs needed to change the status quo. These different approaches need to be reconciled for any meaningful comparison. The most straightforward approach is to assume that the biodiversity strategies costed are incremental and thus, except for specific financing identified for specific actions, the entire F&A directly reflects on net financing needs. To implement this approach, each activity is reviewed and identification of existing funding sources are determined and quantified. So the gap is focused on each activity and the total can be calculated once the exercise is complete. The second, um, the second methodology is F&A focused. This means that the costs in the F&A and the expenditures in the BER are categorized according to the F&A actions. For each F&A action, the BER can be examined to determine if there is a corresponding expenditure closely tied to that action. The last methodology is BER focused, which is like the flip side of the F&A. Instead of focusing on the F&A, we focus on the elements of the BER. Here, the approach is to reduce the BER to include only the expenditures linked to the F&A. This is similar to the above approach, to the F&A approach, but the categories are based on the BER and not the F&A actions. Again, this solution is dependent on the quality and level of detail of the original data that went into the BER and on the quality of the BER tagging system. A standard F&A report outline would include the executive summary, the acknowledgements, introduction, methodology, results, what are the investment needs, conclusions, and annexes. Cost data can be analyzed as a time series, categorized as direct or indirect cost, investment or recurring costs, by RG target, by NBSAP targets, or by sectors. The questions we raised earlier about the F&A can be answered. How much money do we need in total? Which programs require the most resources? Where are they located? Which sector? Which institutions? All this can be answered when we get all our data together and then we analyze this in the F&A. Some of the potential recommendations arising from the F&A include better inclusion of biodiversity results in national policies and planning. It includes the linking of existing and proposed finance solutions to specific target organizations and results, and the integration of the F&A into the regular national budget planning cycle and institutionalization of the F&A process in the environment sector. One very practical takeaway of doing the F&A is that it can actually inform the NBSAP process. Thus, it would be a good recommendation for all NBSAPs to have a costing or a financial needs assessment in order to determine and match the priority actions with the cost requirements. With this, I conclude the introduction to this session and invite our speakers to begin their presentations. Now I will transfer the webinar to Annabelle Plantilla from the Philippines. We hope you enjoyed this session. Annabelle, the floor is yours.
Here, Abby. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me share with you the Philippine experience in undertaking the finance needs assessment. Okay. The finance needs assessment estimates the financing needed to implement our Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. This is our Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which spans the period 2015 to 2028. Our vision is, by 2028, biodiversity is restored and rehabilitated, valued, effectively managed, and secured, maintaining ecosystem services to sustain healthy, resilient Filipino communities and delivering benefits to all. Our PB contains 113 actions spread across 9 thematic areas. These are areas: forest, coastal and marine, inland wetlands, cave and cave systems, agrobiodiversity, urban biodiversity, invasive alien species, and access and benefit sharing. To determine how much money is needed to implement the Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, we costed each of its 113 actions. So we did an activity costing of each action. We did a lot of pre-work, which we deemed very important. First, we developed cost assumptions, as you can see on the slide, determine unit costs for personnel, consultants, meetings, travel, and capital outlay based on government rates. And then we determined cost frequency, how many times, how often, etc. Because our PBSAP is a national plan, we used government cost accounting codes. By doing this, our government counterparts appreciated and better understood the process. We applied the cost assumptions to each activity and computed annual budgetary requirements from 2015 to 2018. We estimated one-time and recurring costs. One-time costs are usually capital outlay, while recurring costs are personnel services and maintenance and operating expenses. We also applied increment from the results of the initial estimate, so we can have both a low and a high estimate of each cost of each of the 113 actions. The pre-results were subjected to a stakeholder validation workshops. We even did a prioritization workshop to determine which actions are urgent and should be implemented at once. Based on the results of these sessions, costing templates were revised and costs recalculated. Revised costs were presented to the Biodiversity Management Bureau of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, which is our government implementing agency. Decisions were made based on their comments, and the cost of the PBSAP implementation was finalized. After costing our plan, we subtracted the baseline expenditure estimate for biodiversity, which is the result from our public expenditure review, from the total cost of implementing our PBSAP. Thus, we determined our financing gap, 19 billion pesos. Okay. It is the first time for the Philippines to cost NBSAP and determine its biodiversity financing gap. The iterative process of the FNA, particularly the costing exercise, further refined the targets of our Philippine Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. There were instances when numerical targets were revised because of the meticulous manner by which all cost assumptions were vetted by experts. The results of the FA helped build the case for biodiversity investment. It provides information on when financing is needed and how much, as you can see in the slide. Finally, the FNA provides guides on the identification and timing of finance solutions. In the case of the Philippines, the cost of the PBSAP can be used as forward estimates for budget appropriations from the national government. It is also a pipeline of projects for private sector investment. So I think this is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that presentation, Annabelle. Now we will move on to Sri Lanka, and we have Ramita to present to us experience of Sri Lanka in implementing the FNA. Please go ahead, Ramita.
Good afternoon, good evening to all the participants, all the resource persons living all around the world. Biodiversity is part of our culture, our nature, and everything. So it's good to talk to you on this. I'm not going too much onto the details of how to do the biodiversity finance needs assessment, but I'm taking a lot more time to discuss about the process Sri Lanka adopted and the lessons we had. My presentation will have basically a couple of areas. I'll be discussing the basic idea behind the FNA, then I'm going to the objectives of FNA as given in the workbook, then what we should accomplish within each stage, and then what we did in Sri Lanka, how to analyze FNA and so on and so forth. Let me go into the next slide. Yeah, basically, let me start the presentation by saying that FNA is a kind of a framework, some guidance. FNA provides the guidance and framework, but there's nothing to restrict ourselves from being innovative and use it for the betterment of the country and the process to suit the context. So basically what we need to do is to identify the resources required for the achievement of biodiversity national targets, and there we do the finance needs assessment and BR, as Abby mentioned, so I'm not going into the details of how to do it, but the reason behind, or the rationale behind doing FNA is that these are the objectives. I mean, now you can see the objectives as they were in the workbook when we were doing the FNA a couple of years back. I'm not going into the details as I mentioned earlier of this. Let me go into the first objective, identifying national biodiversity targets. This may look very simple and straightforward thing, but it was a kind of a difficult and time-consuming task for us, because we decided not only to restrict ourselves to the NBSAP, but also look at the other national level biodiversity plans, because we thought that it was a good opportunity for us to take some forgotten or sidelined or marginalized national plans back into the stage. I'm sure this is the same case with most of the developing countries, as we are good at developing plans but not so good in implementing them. So if we look closely, we'll find some forgotten plans somewhere. Actually, this was a good thing to ensure the national ownership as well, because many agencies coming together and working on the FNA so that they will adapt it, they will accept it as their own. But of course, we had to think about the resource concerns, not only money but also the time and human resources of getting all these plans together. Ultimately, we decided to go with 4 plans. I'll come into that in a moment. On the budgeting process, we had 2 options actually. This was the thinking process at the beginning, because either we start from the scratch or use guidelines already available, already used by the agencies, because some of the government agencies, some of the responsible parties, they wanted to abide by their own costing estimates and unit rates, etc., etc. Actually, what we did first was to get the buy-in of the senior management of the agency's lead institutions and have some focal points from the institution. So because if they are going to change the participants or the representatives of their respective agencies from one consultation to another, the effectiveness of the consultations are going down. So we wanted to avoid that. And we wanted to get the representations from the programming side of the agencies as well as the administration side, because ultimately whatever we decide on the programming side should go through the administration setup to, budgeting processes and all that. So we thought that it is much better to get their involvement from the beginning as well. So the best case scenario would, for us would be kind of two middle-level managers from representing basically the administration setup as well as the programming setup. But it was not the case in certain times, but that was what we hoped for. We wanted to allow for inflation of costs, depreciation, it's like that as well, because certain organizations, they wanted to be very pragmatic and very modest, and they didn't want to budget for certain expenditures, but ultimately they had to do it in a way. Then making a strong case, whether we are doing it in, the whole purpose of doing this FNA is to make a strong case for biodiversity financing in the country. So if we can't do that, we have a problem. So basically, in our country, policymakers and other senior decision makers, sometimes they don't have any background on biodiversity. So it was up to us to make them aware, as them being convinced is a kind of essential precondition to get budget allocations and achieving national biodiversity targets. So most of the Sri Lankan government agencies responsible for implementing biodiversity actions, they prefer to have allocations from the treasury as opposed to private sector contributions, because some restrictions were there in the system. With a narrow fiscal space in Sri Lanka, the treasury officials were scrutinizing ways to optimize the resource use efficiency. Therefore, we wanted to get their buy-in as well from the day one. So we had to convince them about the economical returns as well. So from the beginning, we were thinking to come up with a smaller budget as possible. Yes, of course, it should be realistic, but rather than going beyond the necessary things, be realistic, be pragmatic, and come up with a realistic budget so that we will be able to justify it when it comes to the budgeting process. And we wanted to identify possible areas that we could justify the importance. So the agricultural importance, the importance of biodiversity to tourism and culture. We wanted to link with those things and identify those things from the beginning. And then prioritizing, of course, it's a very time-consuming consultative process, because nobody wants to see that their own actions are being deprioritized over the others. But we should understand that this is not a kind of process to show the importance of one subject field or one particular agency over the others, but to come up with a nationally important prioritization process that will enable us to ensure proper mobilization of budgets and basically to ensure that the national biodiversity targets will be achieved on time. I'm going to skip these things, but as I mentioned in the preparation, basically we had discussions with all the key stakeholders, and we found that they were in favor of it. But the difficult part was to identify champions within each agency and getting them nominated as our focal points, because it is not possible to influence the higher up as well as, it is very difficult to change a decision once it's made. So we wanted to be proactive and engage with the senior management of the agencies from the day one, because we wanted to get the best people nominated as our focal points. We had to work with 44 different organizations who have been identified as lead agencies. So they all had some key responsibilities on achieving the targets, and depending on the institution, their mandate, their importance to the overall success of the process, the strategic importance as well as the preference of different individuals holding senior positions in those agencies, all affected the process. But managing of this process needs to think about management of this process, think about all these actions, all these things. So that's how we prepared, and as I mentioned to you earlier, we selected 4 different national biodiversity plans, NBSAP and National Red Investment Framework, the biodiversity related parts of the National Action Program for Combating Land Degradation and Climate Change impacts in Sri Lanka. Ultimately, the cost results were something like this. We found that it is more costly to implement the NBSAP or the National Red Implementation Plan rather than NBSAP, and totally we need only 30 billion Sri Lankan rupees. It is around 170 million US dollars. But the important thing to remember here is that this is the additional cost. That means comparing to the 2015 investment levels, that we need additional 170 million US dollars. That means assuming that the current expenditure level will prevail in future, we need 170 million. Most of the actions, like 59% of the actions, were identified as of the NBSAP. I'm giving you the example of NBSAP only. 59% of actions were identified as high priority areas because of this inter-agency conflict, and they really wanted to show that their own work is more important than others and it should be prioritized over the others. So very high percentage of high priority actions and very low percentage of low priority actions, but we had to go with the results of the consultation. And personally, I think it should have been less high priority actions, like maybe 30% or so, but couldn't convince. This is the NBSAP targeting again, different. We had 12 targets in the NBSAP, and different targets got different costing. It all ranged from like 6 million Sri Lankan rupees for the target 6. That was the lowest, and the largest was 7,138 million for the target 2. Depending on the agencies, depending on the activities and things like that, this changed. These are the low-hanging fruits. Like if you could see, so many activities are identified as, very low-hanging fruits, because they need only like 4 million, basically less than 20 million Sri Lankan rupees, and we could identify some of the difficult ones, which needs more than 1,000 million, that is 1 billion Sri Lankan rupees or so. In such cases, we had to work with the treasury officials to convince them about those things, but I'm not going too much into the details. I think FNA is not only a study report, it can be used for advocacy, because we could follow up with the relevant technical agency stakeholders to get their commitment for the achievement of this. What we experienced was that it was more effective if we reach them just before they produce their annual budgeting proposals. We could, because we completed the FNA in 2018, and we found the experience. We had some experience with around 20 agencies. We followed up, and most of the successes came when we followed up just before the annual budgeting process. It's a living document. Of course, we tried to review and revise some parts of it, but not as a whole, because we don't have that much of resources, but we consider it as a living document. And it's a kind of a progress report as well, because our national planning ministry is using this FNA report now to monitor the progress of achieving our biodiversity targets. So I think that's it from my side. And if you have any questions, I'm open to discuss those things. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramita, for the presentation. So we're now into the Q&A portion. And as we assemble the questions in our chat box and in our Facebook page, let me start off the discussion by asking questions of Annabelle and Ramita. From Annabelle, could you please tell us what was the most direct use or result of the FNA? And then Ramita, I would like to ask you this question. In Sri Lanka, the FNA included not just the NBSAP, but also the plan on climate change, as well as the certification. Could you tell us how you accounted for possible double counting of required costs? So maybe I'll ask Annabelle first to respond to the question.
For the Philippines, what happened was we were able to mainstream our NBSAP targets into the Philippine Development Plan, our medium-term development plan. What happened was, particularly for the coastal and marine actions that were in our PBSAP, these were all incorporated into the Philippine Development Plan. And this resulted into the Department of Budget and Management plotting about $12 million. I think it was the entire budget for the coastal and marine program of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So in a way, the costing exercise that we did for our PBSAP paid off, because when the Department of Budget Management asked for a program or a project, Department of Environment and Natural Resources presented all the priority actions for coastal and marine ecosystems in our PBSAP. So it was quite, it facilitated the appropriation, the national budget appropriation for coastal and marine ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, for your response. So we would just like to emphasize, when we do a very comprehensive costing of the NBSAP and or related action plans, it creates an atmosphere of credibility, and it actually contributes to, as Annabelle pointed out, a good business case for for funding, and this is what happened to the coastal program for the Philippines. Ramita, please. We are very interested to hear your comments about the three or more or four plans.
Yeah, actually, Abby, all the four plans were managed by the same ministry, Minister of Environment in Sri Lanka. Actually, the national, we took only the biodiversity related actions of the National Action Program for Combating Land Degradation and National Action Program for Adaptation Plan for Climate Change. So we were very specific on selecting the biodiversity related actions out of those two plans. And then what we did was that basically the budgeting, when it comes to the budgeting, everything was streamlined through the same biodiversity section of the ministry, so that we were able to avoid the double counting. So basically we had some discipline over kind of identifying the actions that are contributing to the biodiversity national plans. That's how we did it.
Thanks for the response, Ramita. So as you pointed out, it's really very important, especially in the preparation process for the FNA, to identify the partner ACs who would participate in this exercise. And in the case of Sri Lanka, despite the fact that there were four plans being costed, the fact that it was managed directly by the Ministry of Environment prevented any types of double counting to occur. All right, so thanks again for those clarifications, Annabelle and Ramita. We're now prepared to respond to questions on the chat box or Facebook feed. Hi, Jonathan. So there's a question here from Jonathan Porter. How did you reconcile the incompatibility of the BER and FNA to estimate unmet biodiversity finance needs? So may I ask, Ramita, maybe you can go first, and then I'll ask Annabelle also to try to respond to this question.
The timeline of the two reports, because biodiversity expenditure review looks at the historical records, and FNA is more to do with the futuristic work. So and the assumptions like whether there's any guarantee that the past investments will be the same for the future and things like that. So it was a kind of a challenge, but in Sri Lanka because one, I don't know whether it is a good thing or bad thing, because anyway our investments on biodiversity was very small and kind of a negligible amount. So we assumed that level, that minimum level will prevail for the future without any changing. That was like 0.003% of the national budget or so, something like that. But we assume that situation will be the future scenario as well. But of course, if the numbers are changing rapidly, if models can't predict the future investments from the government and other parties, it would be very difficult. And one other aspect, one other experience we had in Sri Lanka was that the private sector investments were very low again, and we couldn't get any reliable information over the big investors. So basically, even though it was not the best case scenario, we had some default kind of situations that we were able to, basically support us to confront this issue. Hope I was clear enough.
Yes, Ramita, thank you very much. Maybe I can ask Annabelle now to share her insights on the seeming incompatibility of the BR and FNA.
Very much like what Abby and Ramita mentioned earlier, the BER is actually the historical figures in terms of investments for biodiversity, while the FNA actually is more prospective. In the case of the Philippines, we actually use this, particularly, our unmet biodiversity finance needs. We use this to build our case for increased biodiversity investments. Our government partner, which is the Biodiversity Management Bureau, managed to advocate this very well because in the last 2 years, our General Appropriations Act carried a very special provision which mandated all government agencies to integrate biodiversity in their plans and programs. And so I think by having this, the results of the FNA, telling people that, we need to invest more in biodiversity because the economic value and the economic benefits that we get from biodiversity is actually 1,000 times more than the current government budget that is allocated for biodiversity. So in the case of the Philippines, we use it for advocacy and for awareness raising so that, our policymakers and decision makers can be more or less convinced to invest more in diversity conservation, as well as, of course, encourage the private sector to actively participate in biodiversity conservation. I hope that answers your question.
For that response, and thank you, Jonathan, for the question. Jonathan, it's not a guarantee, but one of the ways we can remedy the incompatibility of the BER and FNA, and this is what the Philippines actually has done, is to ensure that the institutions involved in the BER and FNA process are both represented when you do the two methodologies. This is related to, of course, when you look at the PIR and determine the different mandates of the agencies. So to make sure that we are talking about the same sample, we try to use the same institutions that are involved in both the BR and the FNA. But having said that, I just want to stress that had we known all of these experiences when we started it would have been improved. And as what I presented earlier, methods which can actually improve on this to remedy this incompatibility, which is you do it either from the FNA point of view or you do it either from the BER point of view. So all the actions from the FNA, you do one by one and determine how much is currently being spent. Or you can do it for the BER and determine what actions have been historically tagged for biodiversity and determine what are the future costs. Of course, the incompatibility cannot be totally erased because what we find in the budgeting system is really not the same as the cost elements when we do our biodiversity planning. So it can be minimized, but still the challenges are there. And maybe as we try to progress and improve on the methodology, we will be able to have a better view on this, on estimating unmet needs or the finance gap. Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe we can proceed to the next question. From Fidele. Hello, Fidele. Some countries do experience extreme events that can be detrimental to biodiversity, but can be predictable timeframes and extent. Could such information, if known with accuracy, be taken into account for BER and FNA? Okay, Ramita, may I ask you to try to respond to this question first?
I think yes, because I mean we had one experience related to the FNA, not BER, that it was due to some in situ conservation of wild rice varieties in I mean, those things are located in drought-prone area, and how to, go with that. So basically, they predicted that once in 3 years that they are experiencing this drought situation in that particular area, and they costed accordingly, like they increased the number of visits, the monitoring programs and things like that. But that was the only occasion that we were able to, we experienced related to this question. Again, it's only in the FNA. I think it is possible if it is predictable, and anyway we are leaving some room for miscellaneous things as well as contingencies. So then we could accommodate that in the FNA. BER, of course, it's already in the books, because if something have happened in a particular era, a particular year, that should have been now captured in the budgets, and so it's already there, it's automatically there. But FNA is also, it is possible to accommodate such things if we know.
Thank you, Ramita. Thanks for that clarification. So yes, Fidele, if you have this sort of cost modeling, it is possible to impute this into the FNA as you have suggested. There could be some cost modeling approaches, especially for certain species that are affected by climate change. So species affected by climate change, as well as for ecosystem restoration. Thank you, Fidele, for that question. Okay, next question is again from Fidele. I can see that both PER and FNA require the expertise in budgeting at national level, and most of the time, the people who hold such expertise sit in the Ministry of Finance. Now, how is it easy to get such people who usually are quite busy and who find biodiversity as a domain quite far from theirs? It's very nice. I wish to have an insight from the two case studies of Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Very nice question. Ramita, are you still there? Would you be able to help us here?
Actually, we found some good champions in the Ministry of Planning, Treasury, and Ministry of Finance. So we were fortunate in that level. But I think, apart from that, there are some budgetary, experts who knows about the situation, because some people who have worked in the treasury and now transferred to the ministries and things like that. So most of the time we were able to find a champion in the administrative sectors of the lead agencies, who had some experience in understanding how the Minister of Finance and Treasury thinks. So I think that is why I mentioned about getting two focal points for the same from the same agency. One from the programming side, who's knowledgeable about the technical things, and one person from the administration side who's knowledgeable on the budgeting and convincing the treasury and finance processes and things like that. Wherever we had those two champions, we had very good results. Probably that's a kind of a good practice that we could recommend for others as well. Hope my answer was clear. And
yes, thank you, Ramita. But I just want to pursue more the question posed by Fidele. As you will note, Fidele, part of the process of BIOFIN is preparing and setting up a system where this data can be generated. So despite the fact that we are working very closely with both the Department of the Ministry of Environment or Planning or Finance, BIOFIN sets up a small group of experts who are tasked to be able to help. So your point about the Ministry of Finance being very busy, actually all of our partners are always busy all the time. So the idea is to have a technical support from the BIOFIN team, working with them and providing this kinds of support. Like in the Philippines, Annabelle just sent me information because it's unfortunate she could not speak yet, but she sent me information that all the cost matrices, the tables were prepared by BIOFIN, the BIOFIN team, and this was consulted with the relevant ministries. So it became very useful, and now that template is sort of a living template. It can be used also for other costing exercises, and in fact, it's already being requested from the BIOFIN Philippines team to utilize the same template and apply to projects funded by the Asian Development Bank, as well as to the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. The other thing that I'd like to also stress here is that you are right about the Ministry of Finance always deferring to the Ministry of Agriculture, of Environment, when it comes to biodiversity. But this time, it's it's like empowering also the Ministry of Environment to start really putting all the numbers in a very sensible format, which they can use in order to make the business case. Oftentimes, our partners with the Ministries of Environment, they know their stuff, they know everything, the technical aspects of biodiversity, but putting the numbers in a form that can be easily communicated to those in the Ministry of Finance or Budget is a skill that can be improved and that they can learn in the whole BIOFIN process. And we see, for example, our counterparts in the Ministries of Environment being more eloquent in the way they can communicate about their budgets. On the other hand, we are also seeing the ministers of finance or budget or planning being very well versed and being very comfortable talking about biodiversity in this whole experience of implementing BIOFIN in their country. Thanks, Ridele, for the question. Maybe we can move on to the next one.
Abby, if I can just intervene something.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Actually, this is, I mean, one important aspect related to the BIOFIN process is that most of the time we are working with the Minister of Finance or Planning, opposed to the Minister of Environment, because normally, I mean, traditional biodiversity projects normally being handled by the Environment Ministry, that's true, but BIOFIN project is mostly to do with the biodiversity finance, and so I mean we work closely with the Minister of Planning and Finance as much as we do with the Minister of Environment. So that is a kind of a capacity building opportunity for the Minister of Finance as well, because they also getting exposure to the biodiversity related issues, and I found that now they are freely discussing with each other, the Minister of Environment officials and the Minister of Finance people. They have closer links and kind of good avenues to discuss their own issues after the BIOFIN project. So it's a kind of good capacity building opportunity provided by the BIOFIN process. Thanks.
Thank you, Ramita. Before we leave this topic, I just want to emphasize one thing, and Annabelle also sent me a message which she wanted to communicate. We want to emphasize that based on the experience of the Philippines, it was very useful that we use the budget codes of government. We use their accounting codes that's available. It's public data. And because of this, it became very easy for them to associate themselves with the information, with the cost information that we set up. And this is also one of the reasons why it was very easy for the government to have picked up as an investment project the coastal program that the Philippines Biofin team costed and designed. Okay, so perhaps we can leave this topic now and move on to the next question. How long did it take to perform BER and FNA in these case studies? Ramita, how long did it take you in Sri Lanka?
BER, I think around it took around 7 months, and FNA was also took around 7 to 8 months. We did them parallelly, I mean, we didn't wait for the results of one for the other, but it took around 7 to 8 months.
Okay, thank you. In the case of the Philippines, it took about a year for the BER and the FNA. Like Sri Lanka, it was a simultaneous process where we were doing both the BER and FNA. It includes setting up the cost tables, collecting the data, and lots and lots and lots of consultations. Is FNA a one-off exercise? If not, how often should it be done? If done only once, can it be updated as more information, more needs arise? Ramita, would you like to respond to this?
I mentioned in my presentation as well, because I mean for the BIOFIN process, if we think about the project approach, yes, it was done only once, but I mean, these are the products that we could take out of the project approach as well. I mean, these are nationally owned products, so this can be repeated, but I mean, we have reviewed and revised for one agency recently, because Sri Lanka experienced huge changes in the foreign, I mean, the exchange rates. Because of that, they really wanted to change the numbers, because they were depending on some imported technical equipments and things like that, and they found it very useful exercise. Of course, I mean, it can be done, but I'm not sure whether they could do it annually also, but definitely by the mid, I mean, by the when they are doing the midterm review of NBSAP, they could have a relook at it, and when they are doing the next NBSAP also, kind of a 3-year, 4-year cycle would be sufficient, I think.
Thank you, Ramita. We are now also reviewing our NBSAP, so that might be a good opportunity to review the FNA. But also we have been pointing out that the BIOFIN methodology can be applied not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level. So sometimes, and especially now that we are implementing solutions at the local level in some countries, we find that we need to apply the entire BIOFIN process at the local level, and therefore it includes doing the BER, the FNA, albeit in a very simple method where we apply the method in a local situation. But usually the process takes shorter. First, because we already know how to do it, and second, because you'd be surprised, but when you target the right people at the local level who are very much aware of planning and budgeting, this BR and FNA comes as a second nature to them. So yes, there are opportunities to redo the FNA, but also there are opportunities to have a different lens in terms of trying to inform the finance solution better. Okay, so I hope that has been that we were able to clarify this question raised by Fidele. You, of course, can continue engaging with us in the in the Learning for Nature website. So I think at this point, I would like to thank um, Annabelle and Ramita for their valuable insights, sharing what they have learned, implementing the FNA in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. I wish to thank also Jenna and Victoria for the excellent technical support. And of course, all of you participants for attending the webinar today and for having a very lively discussion. To the participants of this session, you will be able to download today's presentations directly from the course room under the Week 5 tab. Please visit our website, learningfornature.org, to get the latest news regarding this webinar and the Biodiversity Finance MOOC. We invite you to share your thoughts regarding this webinar on the page in the course room. We look forward to your feedback. Our facilitators will be very happy to answer any follow-up questions you may have. We hope to see you next Wednesday, that's the 22nd of May, same time, for the 6th session in the Biodiversity Finance webinar series. And this next week, we will be talking about the Biodiversity Finance Plan. For further information, please visit the Learning for Nature website or follow Learning for Nature on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for joining the session today. Have a great day, afternoon, or evening, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Goodbye.